Silas never did things like this. Sitting alone in a luxurious hotel bar, sipping expensive whiskey, he kept his head down, trying to drown out the noise in his mind. Tomorrow, his father would finalize his fate, marriage to a stranger for the sake of the family business. Another deal. Another transaction. The thought made his skin crawl. But then, he felt it. A presence. A man sat next to him, his scent dark and intoxicating, cologne and smoke, danger and dominance. Silas glanced up, and his breath hitched. The stranger was striking. Dark hair, sharp jawline, piercing blue eyes that held an intensity Silas had never seen before. He radiated power, the kind of authority that made people shrink back. But when those eyes settled on Silas, it felt like a challenge. "You look like a man trying to forget something," the stranger said smoothly, his voice like silk over steel. Silas smirked, swirling his drink. "And you look like a man who never forgets." The stranger chuckled, low and deep, and the sound sent shivers down Silas's spine. "I don't." Silas knew he should leave. He should go upstairs and sleep off the weight of his obligations. But instead, he let himself be drawn into conversation, flirtation that was dangerous, electric. One drink turned into two. Two turned into stolen glances. A lingering touch. And then, before he knew it, they were in an elevator, lips crashing together, hands desperate and greedy. That night was unlike anything Silas had ever experienced. The man was rough yet patient, demanding yet reverent, his touch branding Silas in a way that felt irreversible. Every kiss, every whispered command, every possessive grip on his hips set his body on fire. "Mine," the stranger had murmured against Silas's throat, a promise rather than a request. And for the first time in his life, Silas wanted to be owned. But by morning, reality hit like a thunderstorm. He couldn't afford to get attached. He was engaged to a man he had never met, and this, whatever this was nothing but a fleeting mistake. So he slipped out of bed, out of the room, out of the hotel, without leaving a note, without looking back. Little did he know, he had just made the worst mistake of his life. Silas never expected to see him again. Dressed in an expensive black suit, he walked down the grand aisle, feeling like a prisoner walking to his execution. His father's words echoed in his mind, "Do this for the family, Silas. You have no choice." But as he lifted his gaze to the altar, his heart stopped. The man standing there wasn't a stranger. It was him. Damien. His one-night lover. The man he had walked away from. And judging by the wicked smirk curling Damien's lips, he had known exactly who he was marrying all along. Silas barely had time to process the betrayal before Damien was gripping his hand, pulling him close as he murmured against his ear, "You thought you could leave me, Bello. You thought one night was enough. I don't share, and I don't let go. Now, you're mine. Forever." Silas's breath hitched, his pulse racing. This wasn't a marriage. It was a trap. At first, their marriage was a battlefield. Silas refused to submit to Damien's control. He fought back, meeting his husband's cold glares with equal fire, refusing to be a pawn in his game. But Damien was patient. Possessive. Ruthless. He didn't force. He didn't demand. He simply waited. Waited for Silas to realize that every time someone threatened him, Damien was there, silent and deadly. Waited for Silas to understand that despite his cruel words, his hands were always gentle when he touched him. Waited for Silas to accept that no matter how much he resisted, his body still burned under Damien's touch. One night, after a heated argument, Silas found himself pressed against a wall, Damien's breath hot against his skin. "You want to hate me, don't you?" Damien whispered, voice dripping with amusement. "Then tell me, amore mio, why do you always let me touch you like this?" Silas trembled, because he had no answer. Because he hated Damien, yes, but his body betrayed him every single time. And when Damien kissed him that night, it was different. That after weeks of resisting, after fighting against Damien's suffocating control, he had finally slipped through the cracks. But as he ran through the dimly lit streets, his breath heavy, his heart pounding, he felt it. The presence. The inevitable. And when a strong arm yanked him into the darkness, his back hitting a cold wall, Silas gasped, only to have a rough hand cover his mouth. Hot breath ghosted over his ear. "You really thought you could run from me?" Silas froze. "Damien." His voice was low, dangerous, intoxicatingly familiar. And then Damien's fingers tightened on his jaw, forcing him to look up. "You're mine, Silas," he whispered, his blue eyes burning with something raw. "Till death do us part." Damien dragged Silas back to their home, no, his prison, and locked the door behind them. Silas braced himself for rage. For punishment. But Damien? He was calm. Too calm. "Strip," Damien ordered, voice void of emotion. Silas's throat tightened. "You're insane if you think I'm." Damien's fingers were on his throat in an instant, not squeezing, just reminding. "Strip," he repeated. "Or I'll do it for you." Silas's heart pounded. He didn't understand. Damien had killed men for lesser betrayals. He had every reason to hurt him. So why was he acting like this? Why was his touch gentle, his grip firm but not cruel? Why was Damien looking at him like Silas had done something far worse than run? Like he had broken something inside of him. Silas swallowed hard, his hands shaking as he unbuttoned his shirt. And Damien? He just watched. "You don't get it, do you?" Damien murmured, tracing his fingers down Silas's exposed throat. Silas shivered but refused to back down. "Get what?" Damien's lips brushed against his jaw, his breath hot, his presence suffocating. "You belong to me," Damien whispered, his voice both a threat and a promise. "And I don't let go of what's mine." Silas's heart was a war zone. He wanted to hate him. He did hate him. But when Damien's hands gripped his hips, pulling him against his body, claiming him with a brutal, punishing kiss, Silas realized something even worse. He wasn't just Damien's prisoner. He was becoming addicted to him. Just when Silas thought he understood Damien's twisted version of love, a new threat appeared. Rafael Castillo. A powerful rival Mafia heir. And Damien's greatest enemy. And Rafael? He wanted Silas. "You think Damien owns you?" Rafael smirked, leaning in too close at a lavish Mafia event, his fingers brushing over Silas's wrist. "Let me show you what it's like to be wanted, not just possessed." Silas's breath caught. Because for the first time in weeks, someone was offering him a way out. But Damien? Damien saw everything. And that night, when they were alone, Damien made one thing very, very clear. "You're playing a dangerous game, Bello," Damien murmured against Silas's lips, his grip bruising. Silas's breath hitched. "And if I want to play?" Damien smirked. "Then I'll remind you," he whispered, "exactly who you belong to." And then he ruined him. Again. Silas never expected to run twice. The first time, Damien had dragged him back, punishing him with dark whispers and possessive hands. But this time, he wasn't running alone. Raphael's grip was tight around his wrist as they wove through the dimly lit alleyways of Rome. His heartbeat pounded in his ears, adrenaline burning through his veins. "You're sure about this?" Raphael murmured, eyes scanning the streets for danger. Silas took a shaky breath. Yes. He had to be. Because if Damien caught him now, there would be no escape. Raphael's safe house was hidden deep in the countryside, far from Damien's empire. For the first time in months, Silas felt like he could breathe. But Raphael? He wasn't foolish. "He'll come for you," Raphael warned, standing by the window, his eyes dark. Morello doesn't lose what's his. Silas swallowed hard. I was never his to begin with. Raphael chuckled, shaking his head. You don't get it, do you? He turned to face Silas, stepping closer. Damien doesn't just want you. His fingers traced Silas's jaw, his touch softer than Damien's had ever been. He needs you. Silas shivered, but he didn't pull away. For the first time, he had a choice. Raphael could offer him something different. Something that wasn't built on power and possession. And yet, the ghost of Damien's touch still burned on his skin. Days passed. Silas started to believe that maybe, just maybe, Damien had let him go. Until one night. A cold breeze slipped through the open window. Silas woke up instantly. His pulse spiked. Something was wrong. And then, a shadow moved. Before Silas could scream, a hand covered his mouth, pulling him against a hard, familiar chest. Silas's breath hitched. Did you really think I wouldn't find you? Damien. His voice was calm, but his grip was iron. And when Silas looked up, his blood ran cold. Because Damien wasn't just angry. He was furious. His blue eyes burned with a quiet, lethal rage, the kind that didn't explode, but slowly consumed everything in its path. Silas's pulse pounded as Damien's grip on his waist tightened. Unforgiving. Unyielding. You think running to another man would save you? Damien whispered, his voice laced with something dark, something dangerously close to hurt. Silas's breath came in sharp gasps as Damien dragged him closer. And then, a gun cocked. Let him go, Raphael's voice rang out, cold and precise. Silas barely had time to process before Damien turned, shoving him behind his body, like he was protecting him. Like he still had that right. You're playing a dangerous game, Castillo, Damien said, his tone eerily calm. Raphael didn't lower the gun. Funny. I was about to say the same thing to you. For a moment, the room was heavy with the weight of unsaid things. Then Damien smirked. You really think he wants you? He glanced over his shoulder at Silas, his gaze piercing. Tell him, Bello. Tell him how you still tremble when I touch you. Silas's stomach twisted. Because he hated how much of it was true. The fight was short. Too short. Damien moved like a predator, and Raphael never stood a chance. By the time Silas could even react, Damien had disarmed Raphael and had him on his knees. Silas's breath hitched. This was it. Damien would kill him. But then. Damien turned away. You're not worth the bullet, he muttered, his grip tightening around Silas's wrist. He's mine. Before Silas could protest, Damien dragged him out of the house, into the waiting car. Damien. Not a word, Damien growled. You lost that privilege when you ran from me. Silas clenched his jaw, but he didn't fight back. Not yet, because the worst part. A part of him felt relieved to be back at Damien's side. And that was the most dangerous thing of all. Damien's mansion was exactly as he had left it, cold, dark, and suffocating. But this time, something was different. This time, Damien wasn't speaking. This time, he didn't yell. Didn't rage. He simply walked Silas into their bedroom, shut the door, and locked it. Silas's breath caught. Then. Strip, Damien ordered, his voice low and commanding. Silas's heart skipped. You're out of your mind if you think. Do not test me, Bello. Damien's voice was soft, but the threat was clear. I have been patient. Too patient. Silas clenched his fists. He should fight. He should resist. But when Damien stepped closer, fingers trailing over Silas's jaw, his lips brushing against his ear. Silas shuddered. You ran from me, Damien whispered. Now you're going to remind me why I let you live. And then, he kissed him. It wasn't gentle. It was punishment. Acclaiming. And worst of all, Silas kissed him back. Days passed. Silas was trapped. Trapped in Damien's world, trapped in his arms, trapped in the slow, torturous way Damien undid him every night. But something was changing. Something dangerous. Because Damien wasn't just possessive anymore. He was careful. He was gentle. And that was the part that scared Silas the most. Because what if Damien wasn't just a monster? What if, deep down, he loved him? Silas had spent so long trying to escape Damien. But when the war between Raphael and Damien finally came to a head. When Raphael finally put a gun to Damien's head. Silas realized the truth. He didn't want Damien dead. He didn't want to run anymore. Because somewhere along the way, he had fallen in love with the devil. Chapter 16, A New Beginning. The standoff was tense, but Silas refused to let it end in bloodshed. Damien, stop, he cried, stepping between the two men. This war doesn't need to go on. You already have me. Isn't that enough? Damien's cold exterior faltered as his eyes softened, fixed on Silas. Slowly, he lowered his gun. Raphael sneered but followed suit, muttering, "This is the last time, Morello. Don't make me regret walking away." With a nod, Raphael turned and left, leaving silence in his wake. Damien exhaled deeply, pulling Silas into his arms. "You're right," he whispered. "No war is worth losing you." Months later, peace had settled into their lives. Silas stood in the garden, watching the sunset, when Damien joined him, wrapping an arm around his waist. "You've changed me, you know," Damien murmured. Silas smiled, leaning into him. "For the better." Together, they watched the horizon, their hearts finally at peace, knowing they had chosen love over war.